Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the Innovation for Cool Earth Forum 10th Annual Meeting. Now let us begin the co-hosted event by BloombergNEF, Global and Japanese Climate Transition Scenarios, Business Opportunities and Risks. Now I would like to ask Mr. Marvin Go, Head of Japan and Korea Sales, BloombergNEF, to moderate the session. Mr. Go, if you please.
Thank you, Ri. Good morning, everyone. And again, welcome to this special session. It's a long title, but I'll repeat it. Global and Japanese Climate Transition Scenarios, Business Opportunities and Risks. First and foremost, we would like to thank ICEF for this wonderful opportunity for us to be able to present one of our more important research within BNEF, and we're very excited to share this with this group. And I'm joined by my colleagues today, starting with Dr. Ali Izadi, who is our Head of Asia Pacific in BNEF, and we also have Ishu Kikuma, who is our Senior Associate for the Japan Energy Market Analysis, and hopefully I'm pronouncing this correctly, Jonas Ruz, who is our Head of Climate and Sustainability Research. Today we're going to talk about our scenario analysis and how we use this analysis in order to understand what are some of the transition risks and opportunities companies have globally. But before we begin, allow me to invite our CEO, John Moore, to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Marvin, and welcome everybody. BNEF will put this little picture up. That picture says 1,000 words, so I can keep words short. This is essentially how we've built up the coverage. So it's 33 different commodities and technologies. And we've built them up slowly over time, over the last 20 years. But in our view, these are all of the key components. So as you can see, this is complex system change, and that's sort of how we think about it. Anybody who thinks it's straightforward really hasn't thought enough about all of those moving parts. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about the scenarios that we've built up. So we've been doing scenarios for many, many years now, and really just using the economics and the forward cost curves of all of these technologies, and we built it up from power to transport to industry. We haven't yet included the agriculture, but we're about to. And that's our economic transition scenario. So sort of where will economics get you to? So we've been doing that for many, many years. When the IPCC came out with the net zero report, October 2018, clients started asking us about, okay, that's where economics get you, but what do we need to do to hit net zero? So we started to produce our net zero scenario. So you'll see we now have another one where we effectively use carbon budgets to bend the curve, still using economics, but what is required to hit net zero? So you'll see those two scenarios. And then more recently, people like the global curve, but they said, yeah, but we're going to implement it in our country, in our region. So we really want to see what does our curve look like. So actually this year, we produced 6 different regional reports, of which Japan is one of those. So it's really taking this chart, those 2 forecasting approaches and saying, well, what does that look like for Japan? So this is our scenarios, if you like, for Japan. And then in parallel, the other thing we're going to talk about is, well, how do you then apply those curves? What do those curves mean to companies? And so one of the things we're going to cover is our transition risk model, which essentially takes companies that are active in these geographies, applies our curves, and then it says, these are some of the risk implications. So hopefully you find it interesting. This is just input. The idea is this is a mathematical input into your thinking, your strategies, etc. The data is very transparent, the methodology is very transparent, and we're always really interested in feedback and questions and comments because each year we like to improve and get better. So thank you very much for joining us, and now I'll hand over to Marvin.
Thank you, John. And actually on the next slide, we'll just go through the agenda very quickly. We'll have 3 presentations, and then we'll open up to the floor for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please write them down. We're happy to accept them at the end of the 3 presentations. our climate transition scenario analysis, we actually package these reports and call them the New Energy Outlook. And we'll start with the global scenario analysis, followed by the Japan analysis, and then we'll go to the transition risks and opportunities. I'll now pass the mic to Ali for the global analysis. Ali.
皆さん、おはようございます。
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ali Izari. It's a little cooler today, but I think those of you living in Tokyo, you think it was really a hot summer, almost dangerous. Compared to the past, I think it was on the average about 7 degrees or higher than the normal in the past 150 years. Actually, when you look at the entire globe, the sea surface temperature is higher, much higher than the average in the past. And unfortunately, the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions will have an impact on climate change. It's actually happening. However, in order for us to realize the target set in Paris Agreement, I think there are still pathways to reach the targets, especially energy transition trend is looked at here, and every year there is increase in investment made in this area for energy transition, that is. And last year, for the first time, the $1 trillion mark was reached. It went beyond last year. And of course, renewables related, especially wind and solar investments were the predominant investments. As you see in the graph, they're shown in the yellow bars, the renewables. And for electricity, there has been increase in investment as well. And also thanks to such investment, the production of technology and also other investments, the cost of generation as well as the equipments have come down quite dramatically. And as of now, about 80% or more markets around the world, when new plants are being built, power plants that is, the renewables introduction cost would be lower than the building or construction of fossil-based power plants. And so thanks to the cost decrease as well as the policies that have already been determined, the introduction of renewables and R&D investments will go up. And this is BloombergNEF's forecast. Renewables, for example, in 2025, the introduction, the capacity will be more than 600 gigawatts, and EV, more than 20 million units will be sold in total. And as for policies, as John mentioned briefly earlier, in the recent 3 years past, the net zero and carbon neutrality targets were decided on and announced by many countries around the world. And when you calculate the greenhouse gas emissions, about 90% of the targets are covered in the targets that the governments have already announced. And for the G7 countries, they also will once again reaffirm reaching this Paris Agreement targets. So in order for us to realize that target, what is needed? Well, it was mentioned earlier, but at BloombergNEF, we need to think about the possible energy transition, and we conduct scenario analyses, and there are 2 scenarios. One is economic transition scenario, ETS for short. For this ETS scenario, for a short period, there are, of course, set policies, and the projects that are underway already, we calculate them. And beyond that, the additional costs will be incorporated in coming up with this economic transition scenario. The second scenario is net zero scenario, NZS for short. Now, in order for us to realize the Paris targets, by 2050, energy-related emissions need to be reduced as much as possible to net zero, and therefore economically viable pathways need to be figured out, and that's the most important in my view. And the main report is more than 150 pages long, and there are country-specific and sector-specific aspects that I would love to go over, but I will just talk about the main results, the conclusions, in the interest of time. However, Mr. Kikuma will talk about Japan-specific situations. So I'd like to just give you an overview of the emissions-related, and this is energy-related emissions. About 75% are energy-related emissions, and as you can see, the result of the ETS scenario is we have the various technologies that are used by utilities as well as other players. Thanks to the combination of the technologies used, energy-derived or energy-related emissions have already peaked. And before 2030, I think we will hit the peak, to be more specific. And then beyond that, emissions will come down gradually. So this is a good news. However, to realize this, new policies should not be introduced, doesn't have to be introduced, but we can actually have technologies being employed in order to bring this curve down. But for the temperature rise targets and the Paris Agreement targets are likely not to be reached. Maybe 2.6 degrees increase, 2.6 degrees Celsius increase is likely. And the Paris Agreement says we should aim for lower than 2 degrees Celsius increase. To realize that, though, the different sectors need to reduce their emissions to zero by 2050, and that includes the power sector and also the road and transport sectors that need to reduce emissions before others. Those sectors, they have economic technologies. Therefore, you need to really expedite, or they have to expedite the introduction. However, steel and cement industries, they would take more time or need more time so that the emissions will start declining starting from around 2030. Of course, having said that, as you can see here, different countries have already looked towards the year 2030, and they have announced their targets. The nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, by different countries are plotted here. And so different countries have their NDCs. And if you compare those against our forecasts at BloombergNEF, you can see that most of the OECD countries, their NDCs and our prospects are in sync. They match with each other. For example, in the case of Japan, NZS scenario, which is shown in the blue bar, and you see the red line perfectly matching or aligned. But for the developing countries like India and Indonesia, the targets are lower, and the ETS targets versus the NDC net zero scenario targets, I think there's a gap here, but more efforts will likely be made. So I've been talking about emissions so far, but in order to realize emissions reductions, what is needed? The starting point for the different countries should be different. For example, in the case of France, their energy mix is primarily nuclear and very low in the emission arena. And therefore, in order to reduce emissions for France, the key factor is in the end-use energy. The electrification has to be increased. Heat pumps introduced, and also for the industries, electrify where possible, but if not possible, renewable should be used, or nuclear should be used to generate hydrogen and then use the hydrogen. Now, in the case of China or India, they're still dependent on coal. However, they need to clean up the energy mix, so to speak, and renewables will be larger in proportion going forward. And hydrogen and its role will be quite important. And also, CCS will be needed in conjunction with coal. And as you know, CCS is the highest portion in Indonesia. As you know, in Indonesia, they have a lot of coal resources available. And unfortunately, Indonesia, given the location, they don't have less solar and wind resources compared to others, especially wind. It's not so windy in that country. Of course, renewables are needed, but all cannot be dependent on renewables. In the case of Indonesia, and when you think about the energy mix, the proportion of CCS is likely to be quite high.
If I may, let me explain details about the energy mix, starting with the demand side. As you can see in the case of ETS, it shows the annual power demand, electricity demand compared to now will be increased by 2 times. And the reason for that is, of course, there is a population and the economy of the world is going to continue to grow. And within ETS, the ratio EV is also going to increase. So as you can see, power plant, as for power plant, there will be a need for electricity for chargers. So as a result, annual electricity demand in 2050 compared to 2020 is 1.7 times. Under the net zero scenario, the annual demand for electricity in 2050 will be increased by more than 3 times compared to the demand we have today. Compared to ETS, there will be higher electrification, and as you can see, for generating hydrogen, there will be need for electricity. And the annual demand for electricity in 2050, a quarter would be from the hydrogen generation. For electrolysis, electricity will be needed to generate hydrogen. So what about the supply side? The supply side, as of today, when we look at the power generation mix around the world, fossil fuel account for 2/3 of the total. And already, the solar power generation and wind power generation costs have come down. And for within ETS, in 2050, a solar and wind ratio will be about 65%. And in the case of net zero scenario, of course, there is a need for increase in solar and wind, but it is impossible to cover the whole demand with wind and solar only, as you know. Solar we cannot use during the night. There will be no power generation for wind, depending on the strength of wind, depending on the season. Sometimes there is not much wind. In that case, there's not much of a power generation. So to balance that, there is a need for short-term balance, and there is a balance depending on the seasonality. So therefore, it differs from one market to another. We could use hydro, geothermal, or biomass, or nuclear could be used. And in the case of thermal power, CCS technology could be implemented. And I'm sure that thermal power generation will continue to be used. So this is based on the volume of generation. So what about the capacity? For now, the role of thermal power generation is to be used as base load, which is very important. And for the future, we call it dispatchable capacity in English. Since natural energy kind of fluctuates, there is a need for a power source that can make adjustments. So there will be thermal power or cells or batteries will be used. In the case of thermal power generation, CCS could be introduced, open gas power turbine. It is possible to change fuel or for open gas power turbine. There are some turbines where 100% hydrogen could be used. We already have the technology for that. So those technologies will be needed. In the case of capacity, what is the utilization rate going to look like? So in the case of nuclear power, we would like to use it all the time, because power generation cost is low and the power electricity generated is clean. And for thermal power, of course, there will be a cost of fuel, but renewables, no cost for fuel. So the role of thermal power generation is going to be changed in the future. As of today, we have the turbines and combined gas turbines. They are being used at a high utilization rate, but in the future, utilization rate is going to come down for the thermal power generation. From the system cost perspective, this is going to be the most economical answer. However, we have to change the power market, the electricity market system. If we continue with the current system, it's going to be disadvantageous for the utilities companies. And I was talking about the world, and of course, depending on the market, the answers will be different. So the ratio of renewables varies from 70% or 90% in the case of Australia, but what about other technologies? For example, the role to be played by nuclear, hydrogen turbines, CCS. Of course, everything depends on the resources that each country has. So let me move on to power or electricity, since we're running out of time. So let me just talk about the net zero scenario. This is the end-user sector mix, industry, transport, and buildings. It shows the energy mix. Industry. Of course, already various energy is being used. In the case of steel, especially for the production of primary steel, coal is being used, coke is used. And other processes, aluminum, it is possible to use electricity for the future. Depending on the pathway, we could electrify. And in the case of steel, depending on the locations, hydrogen or CCS will be used. In the case of transport, I'm sure you're wondering, is the energy demand going to come down? Here we are talking about the end-use sectors. Transport demand is definitely going to increase going forward. But in the case of road transport, for the future, EV is going to increase. So energy efficiency of motors is much higher compared to internal combustion systems. So therefore, the end demand is going to come down. Of course, there will be increased demand for transport, but end demand for energy is going to come down for transport. And for aviation, sustainable aviation fuel is going to be used. Mainly biofuels are going to be used for shipping. Methane, ammonia are going to be used as fuel. In that case, hydrogen will be required. For buildings, so a lot of energy or electricity is being used, but they're using gases, LPGs are now being used, but in the future, as much as possible, they are to be electrified, and depending on the location, but central heating could be used, bioenergy or bioheat could also be used. So what is the role of hydrogen? As of today, hydrogen consumption is about 1 million. And in our net zero scenario, it's going to increase by 5 times, which include existing use for oil refinery or generation of methanol and ammonia. Hydrogen will be needed. And for new demand, steel industry is going to be extremely important. Electricity use is also very important, but compared to today, only 50 million tons. So about 10% of hydrogen demand in 2050 will be for electricity. For CCS, volume-wise, the most important is for coal-fired power generation plant. But for applications, cement is also important. For hydrogen, CCS will be needed, especially in the case of blue hydrogen, CCS technology will be required. And by the way, this is something that is often discussed. The ratio, what is the role of hydrogen and what is the role of electrification? Economically, for decarbonization, for road transportation, buildings, electricity is going to play the most important role. But in the case of steel industry or shipping industry or aviation industry, hydrogen use is going to be more important than electrification. Of course, the percentage of the breakdown will be different from one country to another. So later on, I would like to share with you the numbers for Japan. So what about the demand for fossil fuel going forward? Oil and coal, for ETS and NGS, the demand is going to go down for both scenarios. And as you can see, in the case of coal, ETS, NGS result shows that 2022 was the peak.
ETS のピークは2028年。
In case of oil, the peak will be 2028 for ETS, and for NGS, 2019 was the peak. Gas is the most interesting. In the case of gas, under ETS, the demand is going to recover after the pandemic and then the growth will be flat after that. And in the case of NGS, gas demand need to be decreased. Now, to realize these scenarios, what do we need? The most important factor is the material, especially metals. Lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, manganese, and aluminum. If there is no increase in supply, it will be very difficult to realize the net zero scenario. However, there are a lot of good investment opportunities in the upstream, and 10 trillion. There will be $10 trillion opportunity. And overall, our net zero scenario shows that there's a need for an investment of 200 trillion, for ETS 119 trillion. And the biggest area that requires investment is the sector for EV, followed by low carbon power mainly renewables and nuclear. And when we look at by-country investment, most countries will have to increase the amount of investment.
Of course, it is not only us, but IEA, IPCC have produced their own scenarios. And when we look at the results of these scenarios, the most important message is that renewable energy, regarding low-carbon energy supply, we need to make more investment into renewable energy in comparison against the fossil fuels. Well, you may remember that in the net zero scenario in 2050, there will still be demand for fossil fuels. So we need to continue investing in fossil fuels as well. However, last year, for $1 investment in fossil fuels, the amount of investment in renewable power was also $1, but this ratio needs to be increased to 4 to 1 in this decade. And then in the 2030s, it needs to be 6 to 1, and in the 2040s, it needs to be 10 to 1. So I have run over my time. I apologize, but this is all from my side. Kikuma-san, over to you. Thank you. Hello, my name is Kikuma from Bloomberg. I would like to explain to you the results of analysis for Japan. So as it was mentioned by Izadi, this is the trend of CO2 emission, and this is the result of our analysis. As you can see, also in Japan, in every sector, decarbonization is needed in order to achieve net zero. And especially in the area of power, from now till 2030, there needs to be rapid decarbonization. And Izadi shows you the CO2 reduction amount that's needed, and this is highlighting Japan. So in setting up this NDC target, we are aligned with the NDC target when we developed our net zero scenario. However, when we look at the recent decarbonization trends in Japan, we notice that we lag behind other countries, and introduction of renewable energy has been somewhat stagnant in recent years. So by 2030, we need to promote decarbonization by not only having ambitious goals, but by implementing concrete actions. And this is also the same chart. So I'm going to skip the details, but also in case of Japan, penetration of clean energy, electrification, new hydrogen and CCS are going to be essential for achieving net zero. So from here, I would like to look at the net zero scenario and economic transition scenario for each sector. First, I'm going to start with the power sector. So here we are looking at both scenarios of NZS and ETS, and this is the trend of electricity demand. Under ETS, we can see the demand for electricity will decline over the next decades due to depopulation as well as aging of the population. On the other hand, under net zero scenario, demand for electricity is expected to rise until 2050, and this is in line with the global trend with more electrification and more electricity needed for hydrogen production. Next is power mix. When we look at the power generation mix as of today, 70% is accounted for by thermal power plants in Japan. However, under ETS until 2050, renewable energy is going to gain more economic competitiveness, and accordingly, this is going to have higher penetration rate. And under net zero scenario, compared to ETS and compared to 2050, renewable energy is expected to penetrate dramatically in both short and longer term. In addition, carbon-free technology, for example, nuclear power plant and CCS power plant, these things are going to be included over time. Next is power capacity in Japan. Under both scenarios, you can see that until 2050, power capacity is predicted to increase. Especially renewable energy is introduced more under the net zero scenario, and compared to the ETS, we can see that the power capacity in 2050 is going to increase by almost double. And compared to solar and wind power generation, in 2050, the amount is going to be 8 times more than today. Not only that, as it was discussed under the global context, from baseload power source, there's going to be backup power source and adjusting power source. These bar chart is showing ETS and NCS on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is the 2030 target decided by METI of Japan. As you can see, there are a couple of differences. First of all, regarding renewables, under our scenario analysis, the number is larger than that of the government. So compared to the expectation of the Japanese government, I believe we can see higher potential for renewables. And red is showing nuclear power. Under the current government target, by 2030, it is expected to afford 20% of the total power generation. But under our analysis, the number is smaller in both of the scenarios. And this is depending on the pace of resumption of operation of nuclear power plants. And we only have 7 years until 2030. So when we think about the possibility of building new nuclear power plants, that is going to have a smaller possibility. And regarding renewables in Japan, footprint or land area is going to be one of the important issues. In these two charts, on the left-hand side, we are showing share of land area covered by solar and onshore wind, and right-hand side is offshore wind projects. So this is the share of ocean area. Under the net zero scenario, we have more renewables, but in both in both cases, the number is 5%. This is not a small number. However, when we think about the footprint, we believe that this is well within the realm of possibility. When we think about the future renewable power generation in Japan, the bottleneck is access to applicable appropriate land rather than the footprint itself. So the government will need to improve access to these appropriate lands. Here, what I would like to mention is co-firing ammonia. The Japanese government and some Japanese companies are promoting this measure to reduce CO2 emission from the existing coal power plants by using co-firing ammonia. But under our different analysis, we already know that the cost is going to be dramatically high. So under the new energy outlook, high cost means that the technology is not going to be competitive. So in the net zero scenario, we're not considering co-firing ammonia. Here we focused on the economic nature, but this is not only about the high cost, but this is also about the emission of non-carbon substances and energy security in Japan, where we also can find concerns. Next, let's look at non-power sectors. This, just like in the past, in the net zero scenario, what's the final energy mix? And this is about the different sectors. Basically, this is quite similar to the global trend, in my view. However, the biggest difference is the industry use of hydrogen being non-existent almost. Mr. Izadi talked about this as well. So it's quite different from the global situation. So the question is, why is hydrogen not used so much in the industrial sector? Well, the biggest factor there, I think, is the cost being too high for clean hydrogen. In Japan, renewables cost, as you might know, has remained quite high. Because of that, using renewable-based electricity, the clean hydrogen is using that, and therefore the cost of hydrogen stays high and competitiveness suffers. And therefore, in terms of the sector, industrial sector is not really contributing in that section for decarbonization. And by 2030, 40, 50, of course, the government has set up hydrogen percentage or hydrogen consumption targets. However, we are below the target levels. And therefore, in Japan, as we try to decarbonize, CCS tends to be used more in power sector as well as steel sector because of the competitiveness. And therefore, we think that, or the results show that the CCS has more contributions to make in Japan. And as you see on the right-hand side, CCS long-term roadmap has been announced. 2030, 2050, CO2 capture targets have already been announced as well. In that, let's look at 2050 targets. In the CO2 capture number of our scenario, I think this is in line. In other words, the direction is quite good. We're on track in that respect. But when you think about 2030 shorter-term target, comparing that against the Japanese government's target, that tends to be a little lower. And also the timing seems to be delayed compared to the targets that have been set. In other words, we need to expedite the introduction of CCS so that the amount of carbon captured by CCS has to be increased early on. And based on what I have just talked about, let's look at investment. In the case of economic transition scenario, right from here now to 2050, $3.2 trillion is the investment needed. Net zero scenario requires $6.7 trillion. In other words, that is an opportunity of investments as we try to decarbonize. Especially in the net zero scenario, $6.7 trillion investment. As you can see, on the left-hand side, the supply and the demand side both have to have enough investment. And on the right-hand side, you can see that what is to be invested on, low-carbon technology has to be invested. And compared to the fossil fuel-related investment, and it has to be 3.2 times as much by 2030, and the ratio will be, the gap will be wider, has to be wider into the future towards 2050. And the Japanese government, looking at the next decade, 150 trillion yen investment is the target that's been announced. And compared to that target by the government, of course, there are differences in different sectors. However, our net zero scenario and the 150 trillion yen that Prime Minister Kishida actually announced, it is quite in line with each other. So I think we're on track in that regard. But as I said at the beginning, setting targets alone will not make things happen. And we therefore need to take actions to truly realize net zero. Finally, based on what I have just talked about, what are some of the policies that are needed in Japan? I'd like to summarize our recommendations. So first of all, in the power sector, decarbonization has to be pursued. And in doing that, renewables need to be developed further in an accelerated fashion. In doing that, in relation to grid connection, the process has to be more transparent, and also approval process has to be shortened and simplified. And as was already mentioned, access to land will also be quite important. And it's not just about renewables, but fossil fuel-based plants need to be phased out. And that has to be properly addressed in the Japanese policy. And also investment in the grid system is also very important going forward as well in order to expedite renewable energy projects. And also internal combustion gasoline-based cars need to be phased out with certain targets and try to electrify the transport sector. And also more stringent carbon pricing system will be needed, especially carbon tax. When you look at that, 289 yen is the price, but it's actually less than $2. So this is quite low in comparison to other countries. Therefore, the carbon pricing has to be more stringently established and set. And the key last point is that in Japan, the government is issuing hydrogen-related subsidies. However, the focus is sectors that are not that important for decarbonization. Therefore, the focus should be more shifted towards the sectors that are important in relation to hydrogen. There has to be this shift as we try to decarbonize society. This is all I have to say at this time. Thank you.
Explaining the main highlights of our global and Japan scenario analysis, I'd just like to remind you that we're actually getting a lot of questions from our online participants. So please feel free to send them in. And again, we'll have a Q&A later. And now I'll pass to Jonas for our transition risk and opportunities. This presentation will be in English. Jonas, please.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Jonas Rosa. I direct our sustainability and climate research. And really, the mission of that research is to bring the understanding of the transition to the finance industry. So what I'm going to talk about here is how is the finance industry engaging with the transition and how is it measuring progress? So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about transition risk, how the finance industry is thinking about transition risk, how it is thinking about opportunities, and then also how it is measuring its own progress on the transition. And throughout, I'll also talk about how we are helping with that to give you some insight into the kinds of data that is being used. So broadly speaking, this is how an investor is engaging with the climate journey today. First thing is they set an ambition. Set a net zero emissions target or a decarbonization target of some sort, possibly because their stakeholders, their investors are asking for this, or because of a conviction of their own. And then they need to start working on how do we actually achieve this target? How do we measure progress against it? So they start monitoring emissions in their portfolio and what is called financed emissions. So these are essentially the emissions that can be attributed to the financing that they are provided. Now that's quite straightforward for something like an equity where you own a share of a company, but it gets more complicated for other types of asset classes. And then the next step is, well, what does the transition actually mean for our investments? What does it mean for the businesses that we are engaging with? So, as they go from thinking about having an ambition to tracking the emissions, they then start thinking about the reality of the implications of the transition. And that's where climate risk comes in. And climate risk can be split into two pieces. And it's important to understand that the finance industry thinks about these two things together. And that's really driven by the TCFD, which created this sort of framework. They think about transition risk, which is the impact on the business or on the investments of climate policies of the low carbon transition. And then they think about physical risk, which is the impact of actual climate change on the world, and then the impact of that damage to assets, disruption to business, and so on. And obviously, we're only going to focus on the transition risk part. And I would say that today, most financial institutions are at this stage. There's a lot of activity right now on doing emissions accounting. The climate risk stage is happening. There is regulation that is requiring this in some places. Forward-thinking institutions are engaging with this and starting to integrate this into their processes, but it's much earlier stage. And so let's start with transition risk and how this is being thought about and managed. The current model, the current orthodoxy in the finance industry around transition risk is really to think about all of this through the medium of carbon emissions and carbon pricing. And that's a consequence of the journey that they've been on. They think about setting a target, they do their emissions accounting, and then they think, when they get to climate risk, they think, or transition risk, they think that everything to do with transition is related to emissions in some way. So they think about emissions and emissions pricing. It's also a consequence of how the modeling of transition risk is being driven into the finance industry through the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a coalition of central banks who have created scenarios for bank stress testing. And these are macro scenarios, very top-down, developed by macroeconomists who simplify the problem as different carbon price trajectories that drive different transition outcomes. So this is how the finance industry today is thinking about transition risk. And so when you take that down to a company level, if they're thinking about an individual company, what is typically being done is they're looking at the emissions of that company. Maybe they're looking at the emissions trajectory of that company or potential emissions trajectory of that company under a carbon target. And then they are taking a carbon price and multiplying the two and saying that is the exposure, financial exposure to the transition. Now, I think we don't, it's probably no surprise that that's an enormous oversimplification and causes some problems. So firstly, is carbon exposure a good measure of transition risk, right? Only 25% of global emissions today are covered by a carbon price, and only a proportion of those 25% are covered by a carbon price that is currently at a meaningful level, predominantly the European carbon price. So carbon pricing is not the direct measure that is currently driving the transition in most cases, and it hasn't been the dominant metric or the dominant driver of the transition. If we think about the two hallmarks of the transition where we are today being the electrification of transport and wind and solar is the cheapest source of power all around the world, that was driven by internal combustion engine phase-outs for electric vehicles, and it was driven by subsidies for renewables. A carbon price would have resulted not in internal combustion, not in electrification of transport, it would have resulted in smaller, more efficient cars, more hybridization. Lighter cars, more aerodynamic cars. Very different sort of outcome. And for renewables, that all started in Europe with the subsidies, particularly with Germany over a decade ago, 15 years ago. A carbon price would have driven a switch from coal power to gas power, not incentivization for the development of technologies that were completely unaffordable at the time. So very different outcomes. So as a metric for transition risk, it's quite poor. It's also quite a poor proxy, especially applied in a top-down sense. Here, we have an example of a German airline and a German coal-fired power station. they're both high carbon intensity companies, and often this is looked at by the finance industry in terms of emissions per dollar of revenue or emissions per dollar of enterprise value. But if you do that to these two companies, well, one of them has a short future and the other one has a long future because there's no suitable alternative. So understanding the technologies and understanding the competition between technologies and the policies and what is substitutable and what is not really matters, and that's currently missing from how the finance industry is thinking about this. And so that is something we are thinking about, right? And here's an example of how, you know, it isn't a cost that's a consequence of carbon pricing, it's an impact on sales. That's what matters. And so here we have the growth of power capacity additions since 2007, and as we can see in the last sort of 5 years, it's been predominantly, or majority has been wind and solar capacity additions, and that has had direct consequences on the gas turbine sales for General Electric. The electrification of transport here, an example from China, is causing a direct impact on the vehicle sales of the incumbent auto manufacturers, Nissan, Honda, Toyota, in China, for example, as compared to electric vehicle manufacturers, and the market share of those companies is shifting. So it's an impact on sales that matters, and that's how we are approaching the problem. Through using scenarios, and we've talked about the new energy scenarios, there are many others. The finance industry, you know, for regulatory reasons, likes to use the NGFS scenarios, as I mentioned, the network for greening the financial system. Using those scenarios to try to derive how is demand for products and commodities shifting as a consequence of the transition? And then mapping those demand projections for different products, different commodities, for things like, if you want to know the demand for car tires, well, vehicle miles traveled projections that we produce for our electric vehicle outlook is a good example, is a good way of looking at how demand for tires will evolve, for example. So using all of those demand projections, what we do is we connect that to the current business of a company, looking at what their revenue breakdown is today, standardized, and this is the work done by Bloomberg, standardized into standard business categories. And we can map each of those categories onto demand projections. So for example, here we've got an oil company which does oil refining, it produces petrochemicals, it has gas. We can take each of those components, we can map the oil refining onto global demand for oil, for example, and that allows us to produce revenue projections into the future, financial projections that give you a baseline understanding of what the risk is that this company might face if it continues with its current business model. And we do this now for 11,500 companies, which is very many companies, and still never enough, because the finance industry wants to look at things for tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 or more companies, because they have large portfolios that they are interested in, which causes its own problems, right? That needing to cover the entire portfolio, needing to cover tens or hundreds of thousands of companies means the sophistication of the approach can suffer on how this is done. And that's why the models that are currently being used, you know, carbon emissions, carbon pricing, are really quite simplistic because of that need to cover a large number of companies. And I think what we're doing in the approach that we're taking, trying to really take that sophistication in scenarios and in our scenarios and bring that in, allows us to make more differentiation between different segments of an industry. For example, these are all automotive companies, and from somebody who's thinking about tens of thousands of companies, they might think about the automotive sector as one sector with one business model, but we know that there are lots of different business models, there's lots of different products, and so we try to differentiate as much as possible, because if you're making tires, or if you're making exhausts, or if you're making engines, the outlook is very different under the transition. So moving on to opportunities, and I would say that right now, there are two things being done around opportunities. The first is, I guess, the sort of investment thesis approach, right? Companies in this sort of sector will do well. And that's a little bit more bespoke, how to finding those companies will often be sort of sector-based. You'll try to find companies that are more exposed to certain sectors in particular, and that is done by looking at what kind of revenue they're booking, how they are classified in databases such as Bloomberg. And the other thing that's done is, again, the use of emissions. So very common is if you want to have a climate-friendly fund, for example, is what you do is you look at the emissions intensities of different companies, and then you weight the lower emissions intensity companies higher. But those lower emissions intensity companies aren't necessarily related to the climate, to the energy transition at all. They'll be tech companies, healthcare companies. It'll be completely unrelated industries. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring in some more data on what kind of companies have exposure, which companies actually are exposed to the energy transition. And so we have data trying to look at currently how much money are different companies making from the energy transition, what % of their revenue is coming from exposure to clean energy. And so we've used this, in some cases it's straightforward, the companies report it, we can just identify what proportion of their revenue is coming from clean energy, but in some cases it's really not straightforward because the companies don't necessarily split it out, or because they're companies in the value chain that aren't directly making money from something that is obvious. And so we're using our analyst expertise and we're using our data sets to try to find as many companies as possible in order to help our investor clients identify these opportunities. And so we found some interesting things. When we look at major indices, so you see here on the left, Shanghai Composite, DAX, S&P 500, FTSE, etc. It's only two of these major indices are above 5% of revenue coming from clean energy exposure. This is on a weighted basis across the index. Now, that's fine. There's a lot of these are not specific indices relating to energy. There's a lot of other industries that go into portfolio. But it gets more interesting when we look at ESG indices. And so that's what we did here. And so if you look on the left, the top 3 indices are specifically clean energy indexes. And so not surprising, they have very large exposure to clean energy according to the data that we have compiled. What is much more surprising is that the next 6 indexes, the iShares MSCI World, the iShares ESG Aware, these are BlackRock funds with the biggest ESG funds out there, Vanguard ESG US. These are some of the biggest ESG funds, and their exposure to clean energy is less than 10% of revenue. So it's clear to me from this that the way the finance industry is thinking about the transition isn't necessarily thinking about the realities and the businesses and the sort of the real opportunities in the transition. They're approaching this in a completely different way. Now, revenue is great, but revenue is backward-looking. It's the business as it exists today. What's a lot more interesting is where are companies going? And so this is where, in particular, CapEx becomes very interesting. Where are companies putting their money in order to go into the future? This is where there's a lot of interest today. We're getting a lot of questions about green CapEx. Have you got green CapEx data? Because it gives a forward-looking assessment or understanding of the direction of travel for a company in relation to the transition. And so we've done some work where we've looked at the oil majors who do not disclose this information, who mostly do not disclose the revenue information either, in terms of the breakdown that is actually green or related to low carbon energy. But we have a lot of project level data. So what we've been able to do is we've been able to use this kind of information, which is an aggregation of our project databases, all of the wind farms that we're tracking, all the hydrogen facilities we're tracking, all the carbon capture and storage facilities we're tracking. We can aggregate that. We can look at where these companies, how much of these projects these companies have. And because we have a lot of cost information, we can use that to assess how much money they've been spending, how much CapEx they've been spending on those types of activities. And that's how we get to a chart like this, which is incredibly valuable in a world where disclosure is not available. And so we'll be expanding that sort of methodology in order to try and help our clients identify in a forward-looking way where the opportunities lie, where companies are headed. I'm going to skip this chart and just move to the sort of bonus section here, which I had in case, and I think I've actually got enough time, so I'm going to go through it. I see Marvin nodding. Which is how is the finance industry, their own transition being measured by themselves and also by others. And that's really being done right now. I'd say there's sort of three main ways in which this is being looked at. Oh, if I can get the slide to go forward. Unfortunately, the clicker is not working right now. Great. Okay. So there's three ways in which the finance industry and its stakeholders are thinking about the transition. And the first one and the most dominant one is, again, emissions, right? It's financed emissions. And so being able to prove that the emissions associated with your investments is going down is the number one thing that is being tracked and is being looked at and is being seen as progress on the transition. But there's a problem with this. And if we can go to the next slide. This creates a divestment incentive. This creates an incentive just to clean up the books. The easiest way to achieve an emissions reduction in relation to financed emissions is to get rid of your financing of high carbon activities and only focus on low carbon activities, which doesn't necessarily advance the transition or make any real difference because somebody else buys those assets instead and the world keeps going the way it's going right now. Right? And in the meantime, you're just buying more tech and pharma and other low carbon sectors instead. So it's not a fantastic way of creating an incentive for change in the real world. And then the second topic is green financing targets. So we're seeing this particularly with some major banks who are saying, we commit to $500 billion worth of, or $1 trillion worth of financing for everything related to sustainable finance or green finance by 2030 or by some period of time. Now, the problem is those numbers lack context. What does that number really mean? What does that mean in the context of the bank itself? How much financing does it do? What proportion of its financing will this be? What does that mean? What kind of impact will that actually have? Is that a large amount of money for the transition over that period of time? It's very challenging. The other thing is it's what can be called a vanity metric. It's sort of, you make the number as big as possible to make it sound as good as possible, but it doesn't give you any real information about what it means and what it does. Right? So it's a little problematic, and because you want the number to be as big as possible, there's a strong incentive to include as many things as possible under that umbrella. And so that's where greenwashing comes in, because then you want to name as many things as possible as green, even if they're not. And then the final piece is from the outside, from NGOs, civil society, is the expectation that the finance industry should immediately stop financing fossil fuels. And that's very unrealistic because we live in a world where fossil fuels are still the dominant source of energy. And for reasons that Ali explained earlier, it is problematic because it is focusing on the problem, not the solution. What we identified in the work that Ali showed, looking at the different scenarios, 1.5 degree aligned scenarios, is that we need to dramatically increase our investment in clean energy. And that is how we get rid of the fossil fuels. We don't just stop the fossil fuels and assume something else takes its place. we get rid of fossil fuels by investing in the clean energy. And so by arguing about reducing the fossil fuel investment, we're not putting our energy into increasing the clean energy investment. And so this is work that we have done with an umbrella organization for the transition of the finance industry called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is led by the ex-head of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, as well as Michael Bloomberg. And it is basically the umbrella organization for bringing finance to net zero. And we've been doing this work on the scenarios, looking at what are the investment requirements, because it sets a benchmark. And you can apply this benchmark to individual institutions. So now we know that this decade, we should be investing 4 times as much in clean energy as in fossil fuel energy. We can use that as a way of looking at the progress of individual banks and comparing how they are doing against this benchmark. And that provides the context that is missing if you're just looking at the clean energy side of it. And so what we did is we did a very large exercise doing exactly that. We looked at the entire banking industry. We found that the real world, which is on the left, is investing 1.7 trillion into fossil fuels and low carbon energy. And this is for 2021, and we'll be updating 2022 by COP at a ratio of 0.9. And the banking system is similar amounts of money at a ratio of 0.8. So very similar, and it's not surprising. This isn't the same money. This is, a loan going to a company doesn't necessarily go into a wind farm or doesn't necessarily go into a fossil fuel project. But if it's going to a company that is developing wind farms or a fossil fuel company, it is still financing going to that industry, right? So not surprisingly, the global banking system is very similar looks very similar to the real world because it is a reflection of the real world. And we ended up producing results for 1,200 banks, looking at tens of thousands of financing deals in 2021 in order to come up with these conclusions, which found that there's very large differences, as you would expect, around the world with, Europe. This is in terms of where the money has gone to. Most of the financing going into Europe is clean with a ratio of 2.6, whereas in North America, in China, it's just below average with a ratio of 0.6, and then Asia Pacific, excluding China, has a ratio of 0.8. So pretty much in line with the average for the banking system as a whole. And I'll skip this slide and just show the tremendous amount of detail that has gone into this in order to try to create a different way of measuring progress on the transition for financial institutions. And with that, I'll wrap up and hand back to Marvin.
Thank you, Jonas. And hopefully that was helpful to everyone here in the room. We'll kick off with some questions that we got online, and then we'll pass it to anyone who has a question. Please raise your hands, and someone will bring you a mic. Actually, one of the questions that came in, which I thought was very interesting because it was connected to the previous session that was here. As you may remember, ICEF announced their innovation roadmap focusing on the role of artificial intelligence or AI in the energy transition. And one of the use cases that was highlighted was the use of AI in modeling exercises, in particular, obviously, for scenario analysis. So the question is BNEF already using AI, or are you planning to use AI in the scenario analysis?
I'd like to speak in Japanese then. The current models, I think it depends on the definition of AI, and that would lead to different answers. In our models that we use, it's a big data model, and therefore we're using big data. However, for instance, a totally new AI that can, for example, determine the modeling method. We're not using that kind of AI now.
Any questions from the room? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just one quick example where we are looking at applying large language models in particular within Bloomberg is in capturing information about what companies are planning to do around the transition. And a lot of that reporting and disclosure is very qualitative, and it's very hard to compare and use qualitative information, again, across tens of thousands of companies. And so there's a real need to try to process that information and bring it down to some comparable data points. Also, to even find, in the hundreds of pages of reporting that companies put out, to even find the information that is clearly about what the plans for the transition are for this company and that are more than just sort of boilerplate language. So that's one example where we're looking at processing those documents using AI, large language models.
Thank you, Jonas. I think we have a question from the floor. Can you please say your name and your organization, please?
Yes, my name is Toshi Sakamoto, IEJ, Institute of Energy Economics, Japan. My question goes to the first speaker, but I missed your first 10 minutes presentations. I'm sorry for that. So you might have already answered my question, but I'm curious to know any differences between your net zero scenario and IEA net zero scenario.
I'll answer in English. Yeah. So in terms of the way IEA does it and the way we do it, there's a big difference. So IEA uses the approach of what's typically called an integrated energy model, whereas what we do is we actually first look at changes on the demand side, and then we take that into account and then look at the supply side. Now, in terms of the direction of travel, if you look at our net zero scenario and the IEA scenario, there's a lot of similarities. Where you get a lot of big differences is one on new technologies. Historically, we've tried to do a better job of taking account of new technologies, particularly those that are driven by consumer forces, which are unfortunately not accounted for in integrated energy models. Integrated energy models are really good when you have a central planner who's controlling everything, but they're really not good at taking into account consumer behavior. So historically, IEA, not a criticism, but IEA has had a difficulty in predicting rooftop solar or electric vehicle optics or heat pumps, because these are not technologies that necessarily move from the perspective of a central energy planner, rather it's driven by consumers. On our side, we've managed to do a better job. So that's where you see some differences. The other thing we try to do, and again, this is very difficult for any energy modeling, we actually do ours bottom up for every market. And we look at, for electricity, we look at hourly dispatch year around. This took a lot of effort in building up the model. That's why I mentioned it was a big data model. IEA, as well as others, such as Shell and BP, which do sort of top-down scenarios, they typically streamline those things. So they typically try to look at it again from a very macro level and overlay a macro assumption around those things. So hopefully that explains the differences.
Thank you for the question. If I may, I'll go back to online question. Since there will be a residual carbon up to by 2050, is BNEF looking at carbon removal technologies like direct air capture, etc., in the scenario analysis?
So in the beginning, when I showed the emission chart, it's important to remember that our modeling, and I believe John in the introduction mentioned this as well, right now, we have only covered energy emissions. This is roughly about 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And as you may remember the chart that Jonas had at the beginning, the overall emission number is actually a bit higher. So then you have emissions associated with land use cover, forestry, agricultural practices. In the energy modeling, we intentionally try to limit the use of carbon direct removal as much as possible. So in our current scenario, the CDR contribution is limited to about 1%. And the main reason we do this is because we may need carbon direct removal technologies for other applications, such as our agriculture and food use system. Now, agriculture could be both a sink, but also a source of emissions. So we have to be very careful with making overly aggressive assumptions around CDR. The other thing we have to be careful with CDR is that, particularly if you're looking at some of the technologies that are currently being commercialized, they also need a lot of electricity and energy. So you end up having to then add on the energy source for those applications. So I went on a long answer, but right now we're limiting that to just 1% for direct removal.
Thank you, Ali. I'll get back to the room. Any questions from anyone in the room? Can you kindly raise your hand, please?
I'm interested if you could explain a little bit further about the hydrogen piece of your analysis for Japan. I understand that basically a pretty small amount of hydrogen is anticipated to be used in the power sector, maybe more in industry. But what I'd like to get at is first, when you talk about, you've mentioned that in your scenarios, in the net zero scenario, there's more electricity required because you need to generate the hydrogen. So is that electricity generated in Japan, or are you talking about imported hydrogen where the electricity is generated outside? And how do you keep the accounts straight as between countries of where the electricity is generated?
Thank you for your question. So in our modeling, we only take into account for the domestically produced hydrogen within Japan. So the hydrogen included in the electricity consumption chart using the electricity demand for the hydrogen production in Japan. And
maybe to answer more about the global, in general, we try to, as much as possible, look at domestic demand being met with domestic supply. For a country like Japan, where there's no existing interconnections, so we haven't made any assumptions around that. So we essentially, for Japan, we modeled it as an island as is. So in reality, what our scenario means is that basically Japan's current dependence on fossil fuel imports can be reduced significantly. Now, the reason we don't have hydrogen import numbers in the modeling is we're doing economic modeling. So what happens is that the moment that we put in the import costs in the modeling, the model says this option is not economically the best option. So for example, for steel in Japan, the model basically says that if you're going to do primary steel in Japan, given all the inputs that you've given me, CCS is the better option. You're not going to be, or more importantly, reduce the iron ore in Australia, bring the reduced iron ore to Japan and use that. So don't try to do hydrogen direct reduction in Japan because you're importing both the hydrogen as well as the iron ore and doing it here. Then this product becomes economically uncompetitive. What you should be doing is bring the reduced iron ore, or if you really have to do it here, then you're better off just using CCS. So that's why in the case of Japan, you end up with a much lower hydrogen number. In countries where there are existing electricity interconnections, we do take those into account, but we don't make any assumptions around expansion of those. So we try to limit that. The grid modeling is primarily about just reinforcements of the domestic grid. In a market like EU where the electricity grid is integrated, then we do take that into account, so that becomes expanded. But let's say in Asia Pacific, where the Asia supergrid, for example, some proponents of that, that's something that we don't model because it becomes, while economically it's actually not a bad option, the politics of that is very difficult. So if you model that, then you end up with a very beautiful scenario, which is basically very difficult to realize.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, and we'll reserve it from anyone from the audience. If not, I think we can close the session. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for listening.